Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. So today we're going to cover seven, we're classing them as tweaks. You can decide how far you take these tweaks, but we're going to cover seven of them on the basis that sometimes it's about an evolution rather than a revolution. Quite often, companies will get to a point where they think a rebrand is a requirement, and sometimes that is the case. But then there's other times where a lot of what they've got in place is actually of a decent standard and is reflecting them well, but things need to evolve. You constantly need to maintain and improve a brand. So we thought it might be nice for 2025 to just go through seven areas that you could identify and look at, rather than just thinking that you've got to reinvent absolutely everything. So just to start with a little story from quite a few years back when I was studying at Newcastle, my tutor back then said to me, you should look after a brand like looking in the mirror, on the basis that every day you look into the mirror, nothing really changes. But if you look back over a year, 5 years, there's dramatic change. So the idea being that you're just evolving through time. So you're staying pretty true to yourself. Everything's pretty similar, but things will change. Whether that's clothes you're wearing, your hairstyle, or just your face generally changing over time. It's not often radical change. It's about an evolution through time. And that always stuck with me. You'd also reference Kit Kat as a brand. And if you think about the wrapper, for example, in your head, it's probably never really changed, but every year it's been in existence, it will have been slightly modernized, but it coincides with being one of the most sold bars globally as well. So I'm not saying that's completely down to the fact they've kept a consistent wrapper, but it'll be a big part of recognition and recall, and then keeping like standards and quality. So I always think it's a good story to tell about looking in the mirror and trying to treat your brand and your organization like that. So these are seven things that we're going to cover. An audit of a brand, some microcopy, looking at navigation maybe, specifically on a web page, how micro animations could be brought into play, how you could shift certain content, not removing the text, but if you've got text-based content, can you reinvent that in another format? Looking at color palettes, and then targeted messaging. So just maybe looking at your audiences again a little bit more and thinking, is there any way we could reshape some content to make it more appropriate? So before we dive into this first bit, we've just got a couple of slides which kind of discuss what is the difference between terms like a rebrand or a refresh or tweaking something or evolving through time. So we're just showing some examples which can open up a bit of a debate. If you've got comments, feel free to throw in some comments. And if there are any questions as well, we will pick them up at the end in a Q&A. But we're picking out Duolingo here, which we pick out a couple of times in today's presentation. And although people would argue that this isn't necessarily a tweak, if you go back to my analogy of looking in the mirror, there's a green owl consistently played out throughout time, from 2011 to 2019. So they've kept some element the same, and then over time the character's evolved and become the brand that it's become to date. And no doubt, in conjunction with this, color palettes have slightly tweaked, become a little bit brighter. Typography, tone of voice has no doubt changed. And the guidelines that have been recently produced by Duolingo, we sometimes reference them as some of the best guidelines that have ever been produced. So if you've never seen them, it's worth exploring it. But this is an evolution, although it could be deemed reasonably dramatic each time. There's still a consistency of color and this particular character. Then you've got other things that happened quite recently, nationwide, refreshing a brand. Again, people will argue about whether the character of the brand has been taken away from the original, and we've gone for this approach that seems quite standardized in the modern world. There are elements that have been kept, like the shape and the structure of the icon on the house. Bits of that have been kept, but simplified. The font has obviously changed quite a bit. It definitely feels more modern. So I don't think anyone could necessarily argue that nationwide didn't need to refresh its brand, because I think the logo itself just naturally looks a little bit dated. So again, looking in the mirror and looking back 5-6 years, you realize that you were wearing different clothes to what you'd wear today. Equally, from a functional perspective, the Nationwide logo, the old one, doesn't really work in the modern world. It's trapped by a box. It's trapped by the red line going through the icon. And so it won't be as flexible a device. It'd be harder to animate. It'd be harder to work in avatars, in social channels and so forth. So whether people like the change or not, there are things that have been kept consistent, color palettes and so forth, an evolution of the icon. Obviously, the typography is probably the biggest change in here. But it's still evolved through a period of time. More dramatic change because it went from left to right. And the best brands on the planet are the ones that subtly change, like the Kit Kat example, or even Apple or someone like that, where you don't see as dramatic a change. They seem to be the brands that have greater success as well, because there's an element of trust and loyalty and consistency. And then you've got other things that you'd class as a bigger rebrand. So you may not be familiar with this brand, but MoMA over here on the left, maybe fine at the time. I think we could look at it now and say it feels a bit dated, but then quite a shift to what is on the right here. They've got a number of different coloured packaging. It's modernized, there's no doubt about that. It feels a bit fresher. But one of our designers buys into this brand, and for about 2 or 3 weeks, thought Tesco had stopped selling it. Because the rebrand was so different, just hadn't spotted it for some reason. So sometimes dramatic change is required, and no doubt the brief from MoMA and the agency that worked on it, that was what was identified. So the change is more dramatic, and the only thing that's really been kept is the spelling of the name. Everything else has been moved on. So this is more of a rebrand and a bigger shift, but that can come with a downside, like one of your loyal customers not spotting it in an aisle for a couple of weeks as well. And that might happen to a number of people. So you've always got to be aware of how much change is required at any given point in time. And then something else we were looking at, again, quite simple really. And this is, as we get into the 7 tweaks, you'll start to see the things that can be achieved. But this was using the Wayback Machine, looking at the Nike's website, which still seems quite clean, reasonably easy to navigate across the top. And then a few years on from that, this is what then they created. So you could argue from the top level, not a massive shift, but then they've created this mega menu here. And at first sight, you might think it's quite well organized. As you look a little bit closer, you can argue it becomes a little bit clumsy in places. Obviously, the main title here for shoes is in caps and bold. So that's like standardized to lead into all the other areas underneath that. But then accessories and equipment trapped under clothing here feels a little bit clumsy. There's no divider line here, but there is there because that's deemed to be different. So as you start to analyze it, you can argue it could be improved or simplified in some way. And then more recently, they've got this approach. So the top bit is not dissimilar. It's underlined that you're in the women's range. And then they've gone for shoes, clothing, Discover Sport, accessories and equipment across the top, and given each one its own column, a nice amount of breathing space. All the type in this case now, because it is navigation, they've decided to go for upper and lowercase. If you go here, they were using caps. Now, obviously, some of that is down to the brand and the brand identity, but there is also a rule in typography that upper and lowercase is designed to be read, and caps is often for punctuation or very short words. So sometimes it's not the best to be used in something like navigation, where you're trying to make quite a quick decision so you can move on and continue your shopping process. So that's just a small evolution that we've seen with Nike, and we'll get into some of the details around this as we go through the webinar. So as we get into the 7 tweaks, I guess the first thing you need to do is at least look at your brand to understand where you might be able to focus. If we look at Hovis, we stumbled across a couple of these posts on social over the last year. Quite surprised how inconsistent the brand was being applied, from social posts to job advertisements to banners. It seemed really fragmented for a brand that I think is generally instantly recognizable, certainly on a shelf or from a quality of a product perspective. But over the years and in more recent times, the whole identity has come quite fragmented. Now, this could have happened for a number of reasons. It could be that they're using different designers, different freelancers. It could be that their internal team or marketing team are being held accountable to produce design and not using designers. It could be people are using tools like Canva and things like that. But over time, you can see how quickly a brand can degrade. So the first thing you can do is just take a step back and look to audit it. So even if after this webinar, you're inspired to do so, maybe look 2 weeks ahead, block out a morning or a day in your calendar and give yourself the time just to step back and look at some of the stuff that you're doing to see whether it's becoming a little bit inconsistent in places. As I say, you'll be surprised how much it can degrade over time. We often see people put a lot of an investment into a rebrand. The rebrand looks absolutely brilliant. It's initially consistent, but then it starts to degrade quite quickly. And within 6 months of a launch, it can actually get to a point where it's pretty inconsistent and it's not being particularly well managed, which is going to cause you bigger problems. And then if it continues in that trajectory, you'll find yourself rebranding again in 2 or 3 years. And the whole point of this webinar is to say, well, let's stop that and then make sure that we're evolving through time and we're continually improving things and tweaking things where necessary. It happens instantly the day a brand has gone. So I'd argue there's only a handful of brands really on the planet that manage their brand particularly well. And then a lot of other companies go through the process of a rebrand and start rebranding 3-5 years because things become a mess quite quickly. So it's always keeping an eye on what you're doing and what other people in the organization are doing. So it's mainly about making sure things haven't slipped. So depending on your business, your brand will be applied to a number of different things. But as a starting point, you could just take that time out and say, okay, I'm going to look at the last months of social media content on different platforms. I'm going to have another proper look at our website again. I'm going to pull out any printed assets we might still use. I'm going to look at footers on emails. I'm going to look at some presentations that might have been done in recent pitch decks. The sales team's been adding new slides that we weren't aware of. And is that going off brand? Are there any documents that are used more broadly? So that could be documents that aren't coming from a marketing perspective. It could be internal documents. It could be documents that are onboarding for recruitment. Trying to gather a few things just to see exactly where you're at is obviously a very good starting point to then identify what tweaks you could start making to get your brand more aligned or just improve it over a period of time. The other thing that obviously helps is to get robust templates put in place from your agency partner or designer that you're working with. Because the world's moving at such a fast rate, we appreciate that people need to make amends and tweaks to things. And maybe this is where the problem is arising, that maybe too many people have got access to design assets, and that's why they become degraded quite quickly. But we understand that's the world that we're in. So trying to create robust templates that can work and then be reviewed regularly to make sure that they're on track is important to any brand as well. So we've just recently launched a brand for a company called Red Rock, which we promoted socially. But we went through the process of creating a number of different templates, from email templates to social templates, to try and get to a point where they as a team have enough tools to be able to keep the brand consistent. We gave them actually examples then of how that would play out with imagery and type applied to it. So that's your template. These are like how we would envisage it. So if anyone is taking it off our hands and working it on a daily basis, then they've got something to follow. Ultimately about brand management. So if too many people are getting involved in the brand, or certainly the design of the brand, it's going to become mismanaged and it's going to become more fragmented. So we offer a service where we manage people's brands on a regular basis, and then we also do a check-in on our own work or any other work that the client or any freelancer or internal resource are doing to make sure that it's hitting the standard that we all expect it to. And that can work across everything. So this is some of the animations or micro animations within the digital environment. But again, we've put all rules and measures in place to how they should play out so people can follow it if they are developing things internally. And there's a system in place to make sure that everything is completely consistent. And the more this can be looked at or established early on, the easier it is to apply to other digital assets away from a website. It could be some portal or software that you produced, or it could be some social content, or it could be an animated video. You've actually got rules in motion as to how your brand actually moves. So it's not just about color and type, it's about how does our brand move in different digital environments as well. And then a collection of how that would play out across all social content. So you've got a visual guide of how to keep things consistent. And then through to iconography as well. So instead of iconography just being found from a stock library, or over time people just finding different icons and adding them to a library, either assigning them to something or not assigning them, you can quite quickly find that you've got a bank of icons that are all completely inconsistent. People have been creating their own pitch decks or sales decks and grabbing icons from anywhere. So if you can create a bank of these early on to cover off most bases and have rules around them, then fantastic. But then when it comes to that day where quick icons needed, making sure that you go back to where you started and brief in an icon rather than just trying to grab one off the internet, because again, you're slowly fragmenting your brand. Other things that you could look at is updating like microcopy. So these are tweaks that could be done relatively quickly, especially once you've done the review and audit of your brand. Now, an example as innocent, this for us seems appropriate for this particular brand to say, stop looking at my bottom on the bottom of their packaging. For some people, that'll raise a smile and they think that's what they expect from innocent. I know some people actually hate packaging talking to them. So that's, personal opinion. Obviously, there's some brands where this would just not work at all. If this was a high-end luxury fashion brand, you wouldn't want it to necessarily have that same playful type of content. Equally, when I'm on the train, sometimes going into Manchester, I've noticed they've tried to do it with the carriage names, but it just doesn't work. It's like my name is, and then carriage XR146. So they've tried to be playful, doesn't work in that particular space. And it's probably something that they shouldn't have bothered entertaining. So with your own copy, it's a case of looking at certain things and thinking, is this our type of brand? Should we be trying to have this playful language in place? If so, are there things that we're doing where we could actually look at it and review it and tweak that overnight so that we've nudged ourselves a little bit closer to where we want to be? This is from a copywriter, and this is like the footer to say, do you even want to read this, and do you want to unsubscribe? Now, these are the kind of things that are generally just left to whatever's been created in the system that you're using. There's not much thought put to them. If you skim reading this at the moment, you'll notice it's full of character. Again, kind of proving the point of what the person does and what value they can add to something. So again, that type of tone or language might not be appropriate for everyone's brand, but it's also just considering how can you make something a little bit more on brand or a little bit more interesting, even in the places where typically this type of content can be quite dull. And then other areas where this is just sign up for MailChimp. So Amy and our team signing up, putting the username Amy, but then instead of just saying there's an error, it says great minds think alike. Somebody always taken this username. So it's little things like that that has been thought through for the brand of MailChimp. Hopefully it's coming from the values and their overall personality. But these are the things that you could review and quite quickly tweak and put into play. And it might just make someone smile or remember your brand in some way more than they would have if you hadn't done it. And then for ourselves, we have a 404 page. So if you arrive at a page that isn't there, then this is what you get. Dawn is broken. It's obviously a phrase anyway, out in the real world. And then just a button to say, we can get you back home, basically. So every little interaction within your brand, especially from like microcopy, there's always an opportunity to make quite a quick tweak that gets either things more aligned or moves your brand in the direction that you want to take it. And this is all aligning with values and personality. So the brand work we do, we will take people on a journey where we need to define or shape your brand values or your purpose and define your overall personality. And doing this type of work, it needs to align with your values. So like I said about the innocent packaging, that wouldn't be appropriate for another brand because their values and their personality is completely different. So just being true to yourself and then finding those opportunities where you can change something. Some of you may have seen this structure before. It's archetypes. So if you've done this already, you'll have an understanding of what you're trying to say to the world. If you haven't done it before, this could be a good platform to say, what do you think your brand is trying to say? How's it trying to be perceived? And you can work out whether any of these are suitable, whether it's a couple of them that maybe you want to embrace. And having this type of structure in place that's been pre-agreed means that when you're making tweaks to something like copy, there's less personal opinion from people within a team because you're saying to yourself, if I tweak this copy, will it make us more X? And if the answer is yes, then you can all move forward with confidence to say, well, we're definitely celebrating whatever type of archetype or personality we want to display. So ultimately, everything that a company does is a reflection of its brand. So that can be in every department within an organization. I think from a design, marketing, brand perspective, often sits with marketing as if like it's not important to all of the departments. But for us, a brand is everything a company does, every decision it makes, and everything will be a reflection of yourself then, really. So why look into some things like this? So you might have a voicemail message or something like that. Maybe you've not been responsible for that. Maybe you've never even phoned your own company to find out what we actually say on a voicemail message or what that process is like. That is something that could be reviewed quite quickly and could be tweaked if necessary. Out of office message. So again, I see a lot of boring out of office messages because people just pick whatever the system says, or they write something way more corporate than they might say if they were just saying that they weren't in for the day or they were away on holiday. So again, based on your brand, how different can you make them? Because that might be something that makes you more memorable, or at least leave someone with a smile or something else. Or it could be an opportunity to promote other services, something like that. But instead of just saying, I'm away from my emails, I'll be back on such a date. I think there's opportunities to be more creative there where you can autoresponder emails. So software and the likes can obviously create autoresponders. Sometimes they're never reviewed by people. Another thing that you could do is just going through that process, seeing what some of those autoresponders are actually saying and how emotive or not they are and how reflective of the brand they are. Again, they could be rewritten quite quickly. I've showed before the 404 error page and the form inputs that we showed for MailChimp, for example. There's always an opportunity somewhere within your brand just to improve it that little bit. And these are the types of tweaks that, eventually over time make a big difference. So as we're going through this, we offer free brand reviews. So it's our chance to promote the fact that we are offering that for you attending today. We will give you a free brand review. If that's something you're interested in, you can drop a message in the notes now and Amy will pick that up. We'll send a link afterwards anyway, if you don't want to put anything in the chat. But the free brand review I'll cover at the end, say what that will entail. But yeah, for turning up today, this is an opportunity for us to help you review the brand and see what improvements could be made. Other things you could look at, optimizing navigation. So we touched on this with the Nike examples at the start of the webinar.
If you want somebody to do something, you make it as easy as possible for them to do.
So that seems quite straightforward, what Kyle said there. So he's lead UX for Barclays, who was on our podcast a while back. And if you want someone to do something, make it easy for them. So the amount of times we see obstacles and barriers put in the way, obviously not on purpose, but people can be spending a lot of money on activities to get people to a website, whether you're investing in SEO, pay-per-click, or paid social. Somewhere you're putting some investment into people to get to a website. And then the amount of websites that you actually see where they make it hard for you to be able to get to where you want to get to. I think Kyle sums it up really well. Is like, why would you make anything difficult for someone? You know, we're all very busy. The more simple we can make it, the better. So here's an example of a navigation comes out from the left in this particular instance, but a lot of it comes down to the space and the layout and then the consistency. So the titles are smaller in caps, so you can see that there's a difference between the list, and the list is simply laid out upper and lowercase. So nothing groundbreaking, but at the same time, it doesn't need to be. This is a navigation that you want to open up, understand quite quickly, and then get to the page that you want to get to. We went through a similar process for ourselves. So we wanted to pick out 3 core pillars: brand, digital, and motion. And then within those pillars, we wanted to elevate 3 of the core areas. So we visualize them instead. And then we had these sub divisions here, and you could dive into seeing all brand services. So thinking through the mega menu, so it's a bit more digestible. And then this again, keeping it really simple, but there's a hierarchy to the type. So you've got your main area in larger text, and then you've got the rest of these laid out nicely, each area getting given the right amount of space. Sometimes this stuff can be either overthought and over-engineered, or a little bit like this, American Express, a brand that you'd think would have a good website maybe and a simple navigation. We personally find it really hard to even look where I'm about to go next. So I've gone to search and book, but everything then is of a similar size. Yes, they've got blue and black text, but everything is fighting for attention just in this space. The gap between the title and the next paragraph is the same as the next one and the next one. So that makes it really hard for a user just to quickly spot, where am I in this navigation and how do I get somewhere? And it could easily be fixed. It wouldn't be a big task to tweak this and make it a little bit cleaner. Doesn't have to copy this style, but you can definitely see how you could apply it to this particular drop down. And so, yeah, it's making sure that everything you're doing throughout is as aligned as it can be. You know, we all know a brand and digital assets are forever changing. So it's a hard thing to manage, but it's just taking that time out to look at it and then think, well, if I tweak something, then we're getting a little bit nearer every single day. Looking at your navigation, you know, apart from it visually being better, like American Express, I think could really benefit from doing that better, just so it's easier to navigate. But they'll also get other benefits by doing it as well if they look technically at it. So whether that's SEO benefits, the user journey benefit, that I can make a decision quicker and I can get to, you know, a product page or a service page quicker than I would have before, making it easier for me then to get into reading about the page that I'm looking for, and maybe make an inquiry. Also, like looking at reducing the number of clicks. So why make someone click 7 things to get somewhere if you could reduce it to 5 or 3? So there's extra benefits to doing it. The visual side, obviously, is the first thing someone would experience. So try and review that and make that as simple as possible. Other things, especially in the modern world now, we're in a world where a lot of brands, whoever they are, live in a digital environment, which also allows us to do micro animations. And micro animations can make a human feel like we've actually done something. So in the real world, we'll know when we've shut a door and we'll hear the sound behind us. In a digital space, we can also make it a little bit more immersive. So here's an example of some of our stuff. You know, there's a couple of different button options there. One's a hover state, one's a click state. If you fill out the newsletter, the type moves up, so then you can fill it out. Slight interactions on the image of myself, where the arrow goes pink and the image goes slightly bigger. These are all really subtle micro animations, but they celebrate our brand and the way that we want to come across in a really subtle way. Well, sometimes these things are often overlooked. And again, depending on your brand, you can change, either how elaborate or subtle these actually are. But it's trying to think through, how do you build in this character and this personality if you've not reviewed that before? Why would you even look at it? Well, some of it will improve the user experience. So that interaction with a digital screen, there's a chance there to feel more human in that process and feel like you've actually done something and achieved something. Element of increasing trust as well, because it starts to look more reputable, higher quality to it. You can use subtle animation to bring a bit more clarity to something as well. Also reduce confusion, so it works twofold. And it's an opportunity to add personality to your brand. So moving graphics, however big or small, there should be a way that they're approached. And so then the moving graphics, your motion guidelines become consistent across everything that you do. And it creates for a better user experience. Other things, shifting from text to multimedia. So it's quite an obvious one. But we have a site that's got a lot of content on it, and we try and share our knowledge with people and bring insights to the table. But then we'll also go through that, instead of saying, well, does it have to just be content and copy, or can we support that with video content? Because some people might not want to read, other people might want to watch the video. Makes it a bit more human. These are some of the people you're actually going to be dealing with if you deal with the agency. So by doing that and just assessing some of your content and saying, could it be brought to life through video to camera, or it could be an illustration or an animation, again, depending on what your brand is like, then it'll also improve things like accessibility. So more people can understand that content, and they can take in that content however they want to. Diverse learning styles, increased engagement, because you may have someone sat listening to a video and staying on your website for longer and learning more about what you do. Also adds a human touch, so they feel like they already know you maybe before they make an inquiry. Ability to improve SEO as well, because of the content that you're serving up. Good way of simplifying complex topics. So sometimes you really do need all the detail and all the written words, but it's a way of actually putting something across in a more simple way. And also more likely that it could be shared with other people. It's easier to digest. So again, you may or may not look at that as a tweak, but in theory, you could tomorrow review something on your website and the day after decide to film it, however, whatever standard that is, whether it's on a phone or you've got some camera kit. It is something you could implement and tweak quite quickly. Other things that we talk about a lot as an agency is color palettes. Now, again, a lot of people will say, well, that's not going to be a small tweak, which I would agree with. Obviously, if you're going to change your color, however much, then that'll be applied to everything. But this is more about, when was the last time you evaluated what colors you actually lead with? So we live in a digital world now. RGB could be the lead color set. CMYK could be secondary. Pantone may or may not exist. It's important to know where you're going with your brand. If you look at some brands that traditionally would have been black and white or deeper colors like NatWest, their color palette's brightened up over time. Seems like they're bringing in more colors into this icon at the moment. So there's a shift towards more vibrant and vivid color palettes naturally, because we're looking through screen graphics, and then that's an RGB value compared to CMYK. And although on a screen you can't really show that, there is a distinct difference between the two. And like I say, historically, most people will obsess about CMYK values and Pantone colors, whereas RGB could be the lead color now, to create a more modern, vibrant brand. And you'll have noticed a lot of brands over the last 5 or 6 years, their color palette is one of the things that they have probably tweaked and modernized. That allows, obviously, for brands like Monzo to come in, where they've shook up that industry, because we're so used to it being very traditional, as if that gives more trust and that your money is going to be secure. Whereas actually people want access to their money, they want to use it in different ways. They want to be able to split bills or share money with a partner to go on holiday. Monzo's come to the table, completely different, fresh and vibrant approach, appealing to a younger audience, no doubt. And there'll be some older people that may never trust this brand at all, and they want to stick with the bigger banks. But that's absolutely fine. But Monzo have come in to celebrate the digital world, appeal to a younger audience. And the platform itself has been properly thought through from scratch. But the color palette is a color palette that typically wouldn't have been used in this particular space. And then PayPal more recently, again, color's not massively changed, but they have gone through the process of brightening it up. But that came along with an overall design system and refreshed fonts and so forth. But this is specifically about color as part of your own review for yourselves. It's an assessment of that. If nothing else, is a color used consistently, or have we assigned colors to products that we shouldn't have done, or are our colors just we like the color palette, but is it a little bit dated? Is it a little bit darker than it should be? Is there an opportunity now to brighten it up, or should we be focusing on RGB over CMYK? Although that is a tweak and it will take a long time to apply it, it's just considering it. And then if you do put it into play, what things are you going to tackle first to move it in the right direction? And then finally, the seventh tweak is targeted messaging. So again, coming back to Duolingo, and if you've never seen the guidelines, it's probably worth trying to find them and download them, or we could probably share a link, I guess, after this. But these are ways that they identified their audiences. So they had consumers from the developed world. So what do people from the developed world actually want from Duolingo? Well, they're basically saying easily the most effective way to learn a language. And that's all we probably care for is, I want to learn a new language. How can I go about doing it? This is a really effective way of doing it. If you're a consumer, though, from a developing world, that's a different story. You might be using Duolingo and learning a language because that's your ticket to anywhere. So you might want to get out the country you're in and go to another country to find work. So it's a completely different reason as to why you're using the app and Duolingo itself. And they've obviously recognized that and written guidelines to suit. Other things could be institutions, universities, etc. So the message to them is the next level in language learning. So can we take what you're already doing to a completely different level? Can you make it more engaging for people and students? So that's what they're trying to say to those people. Prospective employees, so people that they want to work for the company, you can change the world one word at a time. So that's their call to action to them, saying if that's what you want to do and support those other audiences that we just spoke about, this is what our mantra is to you. And then other things like community or volunteer content creators. So for them, it's because of you, everyone can Duolingo. So that's kind of a thank you, really, to this community here. But although it's all the same thing, it's the language that they're putting to them that makes a difference, because they've identified that their audiences need and warrant different messages. And again, it's the kind of thing that you could do quite quickly, is identify your different audiences and then say to yourself, are there tweaks that could be done? Or are we currently just talking in the same way to everybody? So that's the 7 tweaks. Like I say, you might see some of those tweaks and think they're bigger than what I thought they might be. But I think if you boil them down, in each of those, there is something that you could probably look at and implement it in quite a short time frame. The first thing I would do, like I said, is probably book out a slot in your own calendar to take time out just to review and audit your own brand. And then you can go through those tweaks and see which ones you might be able to look at first. If anyone's interested in a free brand review, like I say, we'll send some follow-up emails after this. But we're going to go through a lot of the tweaks that we've just been through. So we would review the consistency and do an audit. We'd assess some of the microcopy or opportunities where it could be better. We'd maybe look at the navigation on your website, micro animations, content and messaging, and color palette. So those 7 tips, we would look at some of those as part of this audit, see whether we could give you a bit of a path or guidance for you then to take away and implement, or if you wanted to work with us, we could help you achieve that. So I guess we've got to questions time. Anything that's come in?
Oh, we do have one actually, from Paul Wang. For large multinationals, there are brand valuations, so you can see whether your brand value is increasing or decreasing year on year. For small companies, how can you determine if your current brand is performing well and whether you need a rebrand?
Right, okay. Well, it's quite a tricky question, really. Because the final question was whether you need a rebrand or not. That could depend on company to company, really. I mean, if we were assessing someone, part of it would be asking initial questions as to where do they think they actually are or want to reside in the world. So for some companies that are smaller, they might not have brand values or brand purpose. They might not have even considered that, or they have considered it and they've written it, but they don't really action them. So we'll ask those types of questions first of all to see whether they've even got a platform to make brand and design decisions. And if they haven't, then that kind of needs to be put in place. That might not fundamentally change what they're doing, but it gives you a bit more of a process for future decision making. Other conversations might come around to find out what they're actually trying to achieve, whether they have a product or a service. Where does that sit within that marketplace? Are they producing something that is quite cheap, as in that's what they want to be? And is a brand reflective of that or not? Or have they got a premium product, but actually what they're currently doing isn't achieving what you'd hope it to achieve? It doesn't look as premium as it should. I think there's a lot of things that you would review from a company of that size to try and determine whether what they're doing is performing well or not, because there's a chance that it's not performing as well as they'd hope because they've got their positioning wrong and their identity wrong, or they've not got values in place, or they've not got a purpose in place where it's driving the performance of the business. Whereas obviously bigger brands over time, I'd like to think they've established where they are in the marketplace and maybe they can identify the overall performance better. Don't know if that answers your question exactly, but hopefully.
We do have another question. So we have, how do you manage the SEO trade-off by swapping out copy for videos? Wouldn't want to miss any SEO opportunities, but really agree with having more videos for user experience.
Yeah, so I'm not an SEO expert, so I wouldn't give you direct guidance on that. I think it's probably a balance of the two, isn't it? We've not got rid of our copy and then put a video in place. We've enhanced those pages with video content and then given a summary of what we're actually saying in there. For us, it's about us displaying our own personality and trying to get content over in a way that's more educational rather than reading realms and realms of copy. There may be other spaces where the content is more important because it is more of an SEO strategy. But there's other places where we want to use video content. So I think it's getting a balance right of the two, rather than completely removing content and replacing it for video.
And then we have one from Georgie that says, any branding top tips for companies with multiple core services, for example, 3, should they each have their own identity?
Off the top of my head, probably no. It feels like if the 3 areas are basically offering the same thing in the same space, then for me they're just either products or services. So I think a lot of companies can be guilty of having your main brand. So let's just simplify it. Let's say your main brand and a logo, and then they offer 3 services, 3 core services. And because of those 3 core services, someone then says, oh, I think each of them need a logo. And then in essence, you've got 4 logos that are then all fighting for attention. And you've kind of lost a bit of hierarchy. Plus, if you then add other services or products, you've gone down a path of creating a logo every single time you create one. Now, the flip side to that is something like Virgin, for example, has the Virgin logo and brand and predominantly red, but then they operate planes and sell broadband, but they're under the Virgin brand. So they're 2 completely different propositions, and there's a chance that some people will never fly Virgin Atlantic but use the broadband and vice versa. And in that instance, they've obviously got a logo for each of those, but there are technically different businesses that sit under the same brand. I generally have a view that if what you're offering is the same, then there shouldn't really be a need for a logo for kind of a service area, if that makes sense. I need to know your business for a decent answer, but hopefully that helps a bit.
So Georgie, the one that asked that question, has asked for a brand review. So could that be covered in brand architecture?
Yeah, definitely. As soon as I know the company, it'd be quite easy to identify whether you should or should not be doing what is being done.
Perfect. And that's everything.
Okay. Right. Well, thanks to everyone for attending. Hopefully you found it useful. Hopefully you can find some time in your calendar to review your own brand and see what tweaks you could put in place to, nudge it in the right direction. Thanks everyone for coming. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.